Marti, can you tell me a little bit about your background, your work, and your general perspective and point of view?
Certainly. Well, I've been involved in animal rights work for over 25 years. I think it's going towards 30, something like that. But I came into this work through a chance encounter with a young kitten that was running across the street that was in this busily trafficked area. I was living in Montreal at the time, and I knew if I didn't stop my car and do something that the kitten was in danger of being killed. So I stopped the car and I helped coax the kitten, into the car. And in the course of trying to find a home for the kitten, I was not in a position where I could keep her. I encountered a whole series of animal rights people and an organization called Animal Liberation Collective. And through that experience, I learned about the suffering of all the other animals, not just domesticated animals, or not just companion animals. I learned about animals on factory farms. I learned about fur farms. I learned about the conditions in zoos, all the other ways in which humans abuse animals, and it was an awakening to me. And I'd always had a feeling for animals, but I had never really put it all together because I didn't have the information. And I was given Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and it had a big influence on me. And at the time, I thought it was his philosophical arguments that were persuading me to become a vegan, I should say. I had actually already been a vegetarian, but through reading his book, I became a vegan. And I thought it was the philosophical arguments, but in looking back, I think it really was learning about the conditions of the animals that had an even more powerful influence. He has some very vivid descriptions of the treatment of animals in laboratories and factory farms, and I just didn't want to continue participating in that sort of violence. And then through that, I moved from Montreal to California, and shortly after started Feminist for Animal Rights with another woman, and I felt the need to connect the abuse of animals to the abuse of women. It just became a logical thing for me. I was already a feminist, and the more I read about the treatment of animals, the more I started seeing connections. And I became interested. I was reading animal rights literature, and as I mentioned, Peter Singer, Tom Regan, and was certainly very supportive of what they were ultimately trying to do, persuade people to stop the violence we're inflicting on animals. But I kept coming up against this idea that they were saying this has nothing to do with emotion, and it's all rational arguments. And for me, I realized it was empathy that brought me into the movement. It was that first connection with that kitten that I had stopped to rescue. And so as I continued to read, I became more interested in an ethic that would focus on those feelings of empathy. And so I began reading and writing, and I was doing my work with Feminists for Animal Rights to try to look at the worldview that was producing this kind of violence. And that became a big part of my focus. It's not so much how can we compel people to do the right thing through our rational arguments, but rather looking at what can we do to free up our empathy. I think we have a natural capacity for empathy that has become squelched in our culture. And one of the things I do is I look at how that is connected to masculine identity. I think a lot of us know that boys are taught don't cry, you'll be acting like a girl, and that a boy child is taught to see his identity as somehow opposed to the female, and I would argue also the animal world. If you look at one of the prototypical rites of entry into manhood, it's hunting. What does the boy do to show he's a man? He goes out and he hunts and kills an animal. And very significantly, in the cultures where this is considered the norm, you're supposed to stay away from women both before and after the hunt. So it's this, you're no longer associated with women, you're showing your dominance over animals, and you're now associated with the world of men. So
that's interesting.
Yes, and so, I think we can see that clearly in the case of hunting, but I think there are other more subtle ways in which this norm of masculine identity has affected our treatment of animals. If you think of factory farming, the whole practice is called animal husbandry. And I think there's this idea that, these men who are running these, farms, these agribusinesses are considered the managers. They, just as the male is in the stereotypical household, is supposed to be the breadwinner and the major figure in the family, and the wife brings in the supplemental income, but they're the managers of these factory farms, and their duty is to control the reproductive capacity of animals, and that is ultimately what factory farming, or really all farming, is about, I should say. You are breeding animals, you're exploiting their reproductive capacity for your own benefit. And of course the prototypical marriage is based on the husband's control of the woman's reproductive capacity. And I believe it's still legal in some states for a husband to rape his wife, because the presumption is that is part of her marriage contract. So it's that kind of mentality that I became interested in critiquing and understanding, and the whole way in which we see nature and see women as somehow lesser beings. If you go all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve, what is this terrible thing that Eve did to bring all evil into the world? Well, she listened to the word of a snake. The snake said, eat this apple, and she did, and she tempted Adam, and this was supposed to be this, terrible act of disobedience. And in our culture, we have this idea that women can't control their emotions, that men are able to listen to this, they have greater discipline, they can obey the word of God or the force of reason, they're somehow more rational, and that women in nature are these instinctual beings that don't know how to control themselves. And so that's part of the mentality I'm interested in critiquing, and just reaffirming the integrity of all living beings.